There has been significant controversy this week around the Shawcross Review of PREVENT that was released on Wednesday. And we're very lucky to be joined by two distinguished guests that are very much experts within this area that will be discussing a little bit more about the Shawcross Review. So firstly, we're joined by John Holmwood, who is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Nottingham. John was expert witness for the defense in professional misconduct cases brought against teachers accused of quote unquote Islamifying the curriculum in Birmingham schools. And based on that, he is co-author of Countering Extremism in Birmingham Schools, The Truth About the Birmingham Trojan Horse Affair, and also of Colonialism and Modern Social Theory. He's also co-director of the People's Review of PREVENT with Dr. Leila Eitel-Haj. Secondly, we are proud to be joined by Dr. Richard McNeil-Willson. Richard is a research fellow at Leiden University, Netherlands, and a former Max Weber Research Fellow at the European University Institute, Florence, Italy. His research critically explores concepts of extremism and counter-extremism. Richard also holds a PhD from the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at Exeter University. So once again, thank you to both of you for giving up your time in what, certainly given the developments this week, would have certainly packed out your schedule. So thank you very much for joining us today to provide your insights. So firstly, I'd like to come to yourself, John. Particularly for those unaware of the background and the history of PREVENT, could you briefly explain how we've reached this point with the publication of the Shawcross Review?
I think essentially, and it's what Shawcross looks back to, is a review of PREVENT done internally within the Home Office in 2011, called, the review of the PREVENT strategy. What that did was identify the need to focus on countering extremism, understood as ideological beliefs, which potentially may give rise to the radicalization of individuals and lead them further into acts of terrorism. This was a strong security angle on PREVENT. So what was recommended there was that PREVENT should separate programs concerned with community cohesion from the delivery of the security focus of PREVENT. And this was sitting in the background during the first coalition government. And it wasn't until the Conservatives came fully into power in 2015 that they were able to introduce fully that strategy to divide community cohesion programs from security and introduce the PREVENT duty upon all public authorities to monitor patients, pupils, users, and so on for signs of extremism and possible radicalization. And then there followed from that referrals to local PREVENT panels and consideration for adoption onto what was called the Channel Programme for De-Radicalization. That programme existed for quite some time, but then was incorporated into PREVENT and as an outcome of referrals to PREVENT panels.
Thank you very much, John, for that summary. So we'll come on in a little bit onto the content of the program, particularly Shawcross's emphasis on the ideological drivers of politically motivated violence, which you mentioned. We'll come on to that in a second. But Richard, in the meantime, coming to yourself, could you please elaborate a little bit on why the appointment of Shawcross in January 2021 as the independent review of PREVENT was so concerning in and of itself?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I remember sort of with the passing of the bill in 2019 of the Counterterrorism and Border Security Bill, where there's sort of there was this opportunity that was kind of pushed through with some of the sort of bouncing back and forth of the bill with the Lords to have this independent review. And I remember at the time it was something that was really very much welcomed by quite a lot of actors across the field to sort of have this first opportunity of really kind of pushing some of the criticisms and concerns around PREVENT that have been raised in so many different organizations, faith groups, community groups, human rights groups, and sort of have a bit of a discussion around this. And the problem was that it became very clear that the government was not interested in holding this review in good faith, and it was simply interested in sort of spiking this review at the first opportunity it had. Of course, the first individual who was Lord Carlisle, who was put in charge of the review, was quickly removed because of sort of legal problems around his support of PREVENT in the past. When Shawcross was put in place as head of the review, of course, all these problems continued, and there was huge concerns about some of the statements that he'd made in the past, of his targeting of Muslim charities as the sort of the head of the Charities Commission, in his statements supporting some of the worst excesses of the war on terror very publicly and openly, supporting Guantanamo Bay, supporting the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan very openly and publicly. And very openly supporting PREVENT, as well as making statements which sort of have huge concern for Muslims and minorities in the UK in terms of calling Islam in Europe one of the largest problems that Europe has to face at the moment. This led to sort of a huge, and of course John knows all about this as well, a huge sort of pushback from local communities, from faith groups, from Muslim groups, who sort of en masse boycotted the review. I know a lot of academics who've pulled out work from the review, who stepped back and said this isn't appropriate. A lot of civil society groups, immediate condemnation from groups like Amnesty, from sort of a huge selection of human rights organizations. And that simply has never been addressed. The review was always going to be a dud. It was always going to be what is essentially, at least it sort of seems to many to be this way of ramping up some of the problems with PREVENT and actually sort of a takeover of PREVENT by some of the more kind of reactionary elements in and around the program, which already, of course, faces long-term criticisms of Islamophobia.
Thank you, Richard. So now coming on to the review a little bit more, and coming back to yourself, John, I guess in a nutshell, and we could go on about this for some time, I would presume, but what do you see as the core issues in relation, particularly to the framing of the review, and also in terms of the methodology within the review?
Well, the review is very strongly framed in ideological terms, or one could say neoconservative ideological terms, and deeply influenced by think tanks like the Henry Jackson Society and Policy Exchange. It does go back to 2011 and say the important thing is to focus on preventing extremism, and to do so through an emphasis upon ideology. Now, the important thing about saying, well, you're going to emphasize ideology rather than other vulnerabilities that individuals might have, is that the report doesn't really deal with the fact that the ideas that it's addressing are not unlawful. It operates in the pre-criminal, PREVENT operates in the pre-criminal space. And so what it is doing is tackling beliefs and values and expressions for being extreme, but they are not unlawful. Consequently, it, I think, implicitly acknowledges that PREVENT is an attack upon free speech. And it's an attack upon free speech in which Shawcross is defending the rights of right-wing speech, at the same time as arguing that Muslim speech should be subjected not just to scrutiny, but to constraints in terms of how the government addresses it and so on. So in that sense, that's a very serious issue framing. But the report is fundamentally incompetent and poorly researched. A lot of the report is anecdote, so makes references to, oh, someone told me, an academic said this and so on. Well, that has no status as evidence. You would expect, and the technical term amongst academic researchers is, you would expect triangulation. That is, comments of that form would be located within an analysis of reports and so on. And you would also expect him to have undertaken something that, again, within the methodological literature is called systematic review. That is, to have identified different kinds of reports from different kinds of groups and evaluated their arguments and identified evidence that might support or negate arguments. That's what one was expecting for the review, but there's absolutely nothing of that. And the third thing is that there's reason to doubt whether Shawcross and his team actually understand how PREVENT is organized. I'll just give one example, but it's quite a crucial example and brings these things together in a way. So he is making serious accusations about civil society organizations, particularly Muslim civil society organizations. But he seems to have no awareness of the scheme within the Home Office in which the engagement with civil society organizations takes place. So since 2015, and bearing in mind that's an important moment in the development of PREVENT, the separation of community cohesion aspects from security. So he's in section 3, he's addressing community cohesion aspects of PREVENT. He makes no mention of the program under which this is done, which is called Building a Stronger Britain Together. And he makes no mention of the fact that that program was evaluated during the period of his review in July 2021 by Ipso Mori. Instead, he refers to newspaper reports, a report by the Times in 2017, and so on. The data on the number of civil society organizations involved, the cost of this aspect of PREVENT is all covered in publicly available documents. And Shawcross not only doesn't refer to them, he doesn't seem to be aware of their existence. And that is, I think, I think a journalist would be shocked, but, academics, we're sort of, it's just really striking.
Thank you, John. And Richard, I mean, a kind of a similar question to yourself in terms of what you see as some of the main flaws in terms of the approach of the report. And particularly, I wanted to ask you, as a kind of an expert in counterterrorism and counter-extremism, as we've mentioned multiple times today already, Shawcross adopts a heavy focus on ideology and emphasizes its role above other factors in inspiring politically motivated violence. Could you please speak a little bit more as well to this, to why you feel that this approach could be considered problematic?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's this focus of ideology, and ideology as being the key factor is very very slippery. It's a very kind of easy focus to put on causes of violence, on causes of terrorism. It's a very sort of easy way of focusing targets, particularly on minorities, on those who are seen. And there's sort of this mixture as well. I mean, it doesn't really know how to deal with discussion on sort of British values throughout the text. It suggests that maybe it's not quite part of PREVENT, but also it's very important in kind of responding to so-called extremism, and tends to sort of highlight Muslim organizations as not having strong British values and not linked to these core hard ideologies of sort of British liberalism and capitalism, and that being a problem. And it's a sort of it drags the whole discussion, I think, back. John keeps talking about this 2011 time. It drags the whole discussion as well back to that time. And actually, I think a lot of the work, and I know there's a lot of problems in sort of the research around discussions of terrorism and counterterrorism, but there has been a lot of kind of broadening out of some of the research where there's a lot of work into sort of how to understand violence that takes place in a political context, how we think about sort of the different structural factors, how we account for sort of racism and inequalities within instances of irregular violence, which have sort of opened up the field and brought a lot of very interesting findings around this discussion. The government doesn't want to deal with these, and it sort of presents this idea as being something, something that's cozy in a way that sort of academics and the sort of the liberal elite can sort of dilute the kind of the problems of terrorism and the problems of Islamism as they refer to throughout. And they try to turn it into a very kind of easy way of understanding terrorism, as if you have a bad ideology, you'll go out and you'll commit violence. And we know this is rubbish. We know this is a way of targeting minorities, of problematizing particularly Islamic politics and Muslims who engage in politics openly. And I think this is a big problem. It's sort of this bizarre mix of sort of the sort of the modern kind of culture war discussions as well that have sort of imbued a lot of the government language in recent years, with this sort of decades-old language of political correctness and this sort of this way of dragging everything back towards a simpler time. I think the government and this review wants to drag everything back to a simpler time when we could just focus on Muslims and we could focus on the problems of Islamism. And of course, there's some, I mean, for all the kind of discussions, there are some quite interesting, maybe moments in the review around sort of safeguarding and the problems of that and definitions. For instance, it does focus a lot on definitions and the problems of defining the far right, but it doesn't seem to have any of that critical lens when it comes to the problems of defining Islamism, which of course is a term that has largely been junked within a sort of serious discussion around this, and has been highlighted quite rightly as a term that's often used to sort of smear Muslim activists, securitize Muslim groups, and I don't feel is used with any kind of seriousness outside a lot of kind of government policy and this review. So I mean, ultimately it's a way of sort of proving the government right on things and dragging the clock back a little bit more to a simpler time when we could focus on problems of Muslim activism and link that towards instances of terrorism.
Thank you very much, Richard. I wanted to come back to yourself in a second on the far right, but first a question for yourself, John. One sort of striking part of the review that I found was Shawcross's referencing of the Trojan horse scandal. Of course, he didn't, term it in that way, but there were multiple mentions of the phrasing, which you've both mentioned, of fundamental British values. And Richard alluded to those, but could you please speak a little bit more as to what those may be? Is there actually a defined set of British values? And also, how were those employed in the Trojan horse affair? How is that being used now within this review of PREVENT in order to demonize Muslim communities and, within this language of Islamist extremism?
I think there's a set of values that have been commonly identified back to 2000 that have been recommended to form the framework of teaching within schools. These are potentially being called shared values: commitment to democracy, commitment to the rule of law, tolerance, respect for the individual, and so on. They were identified in the PREVENT report as the procedural values through which multiculturalism could be understood. They were then, the Labour government gave up on the idea of multiculturalism, promoted the idea of shared values in something called a duty to promote community cohesion. Exactly the same values. The duty to promote community cohesion also included a commitment to improving outcomes for disadvantaged pupils of minority ethnic background included within schools to achieve better educational outcomes and address inequality. When the Conservatives came into office, they decided they didn't like community cohesion. They kept the same values. Now they get turned into British values, as if somehow ethnic minorities and minority religious communities don't accept those values. As was very evident within the Birmingham Trojan Horse schools, was that Ofsted, which had been inspecting the schools in relation to those values, found the pupils in the schools well suited to life in modern Britain, until suddenly it was decided that they weren't prepared for life in modern Britain. A whole discourse about how the successful head teachers were undermined. But the schools at the heart of the Trojan horse affair were successful schools. They took over other schools because that's what the Department for Education wished them to do, to take over unsuccessful schools. And then it said, well, if you take over an unsuccessful school, introduce your practices and policies. Oh my word, you are Muslims. We never realized. So in that sense, the Trojan horse was wheeled into place by Michael Gove himself at the Department of Education in promoting the idea of the Trojan horse affair. So we've had a continual obfuscation about what happened in that case. When the teachers were brought to court, no accusation of extremism was made against them. Yet this is continually the background statement. They were accused of undue religious influence, but even that sort of fell apart. So we have a sort of iconic case, but it's an iconic case that actually showed that the government, in a sense, thought that community cohesion was political correctness and wished to promote what I would call a quasi-nationalist idea of British values, because that's the reason for putting British there. But the paradox about the report, which says lots of things, oh, it would be a very good idea, that Shawcross actually recommends that British values be taught in schools, despite the fact he seems to be unaware that there's been a duty to do so since 2015. And so it's like, he doesn't seem to think that in writing a report, he should acquaint himself with facts. And that's what I think is so disturbing about it. And journalists in repeat, and there's been this continual leaking of the report and promoting of ideas around it. What that has done, I think, has been a really dangerous obfuscation of what is really going on within the report, and it's very poor. It's very poor quality, even in its own terms.
Richard, do you feel that Shawcross underplays the threat of the far right within his report? And leading on from that, do you feel like the government and sort of the Conservative Party as a whole has kind of played a role in terms of, the far right, the language and the rhetoric that is being employed?
Yeah, I want to start off by responding by not sort of trying to both sides the far right and so-called Islamism and sort of justify the PREVENT on that basis, because I don't think that's appropriate. But at the same time, there's a very important message at the heart of this report and this review, and that's an attempt to sort of refocus things completely back on Muslims and so-called Islamism and problematize Muslim activism. And as part of that inherently, there's also this sort of this assumption that any sort of focus on the far right, or openly said this, any focus on the far right is actually bringing in far too many sort of right-wing commentators who are also sort of parroting far-right language and putting them under the lens of PREVENT. Now, I don't want to justify PREVENT and say that we need sort of it to focus on lots of different extremisms, so-called extremism at the same time. But it's very important to note that there has been a legitimization of far-right language that has run throughout this government, that has run throughout the way the Home Office has conducted itself, and the language that has come from it. This includes notable instances of course, anti-migrant statements and sentiment from David Cameron, from, of course, declaring migrants as sort of hordes coming across the Channel. Theresa May, who came sort of through the Home Office as the Home Secretary, deliberately targeting migrants, most, I think, famously with a sort of go home vans that were sort of driving around minority neighborhoods, through to Boris Johnson with various sort of anti-Muslim remarks, and on to sort of the current prime minister or prime ministers, who have again sort of supported anti-migrant language. Suella Braverman, who's been very public about sort of this focus on deporting, on anti-migration. There's also been various instances of sort of government ministers, MPs using openly conspiratorial, virulently sort of anti-Semitic languages. This idea of sort of cultural Marxism, for instance, we've had repeated by various MPs, which has a sort of a strong anti-Semitic background to it. And all of this is very important as well, because what we see, I do a lot of work monitoring far-right mobilization and the sort of the mobilizing of sort of anti-Muslim and Islamophobic activism in various different countries, and we see that this activism interplays very strongly with what comes from the government, what comes from its national government and politicians, and often sort of takes a lead in terms of the language that's being used. And we've seen it through the sort of the war on terror language, which has been picked up by far-right groups. We've seen this with sort of anti-migrant language, Islamophobic language, that often this very quickly leads to sort of upticks in anti-migrant attacks, Islamophobic attacks. So essentially what this review does is it gets another sort of spoke in the wheel of a very sort of virulent anti-migrant, Islamophobic, conspiratorial, anti-Semitic language that comes from the government, that helps to mobilize and acts to mobilize and legitimize a lot of sort of mobilization on the street that is very amongst sort of the far right and amongst those who are leaning towards Islamophobic attacks and activism. So I think we need to be very, of course, it's very easy to sort of deride this review and see it sort of as the sort of the poor scholarship that it is, and the sort of the poor report that it is. But it does play into a much sort of longer term role of sort of helping to enable mobilization against minorities and leads to sort of really sort of long-term insecurity for minority faith and community groups in the UK.
Thank you, Richard. And actually kind of what you mentioned at the end in terms of long-term impact kind of leads on to what I wanted to ask both of you now, sort of wrapping up and looking forward at the potential consequences and implications of the review, starting first with yourself, John. Given particularly that the government, on Wednesday, stated that they accepted all of Shawcross's recommendations, in addition to kind of what Richard mentioned, what are likely to be the impacts, particularly for British Muslim communities and organizations, but also for minority and racialized and marginalized communities as a whole?
Yes, I think it's very serious. I think that we might perhaps have been expecting stronger recommendations than those that came forward. But what I would say is that the recommendations are all to be managed administratively. And so what the Shawcross review does and what the Home Office response does is remove the review from the floor of the House of Commons and House of Lords. So it will not go for debates there because everything can be implemented within existing measures. All the way through the process, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation has said that either PREVENT should come under the independent reviewer's remit, or there should be a separate remit for an annual review independent process reviewing PREVENT and how it is implemented. And that has also been recommended by the Commission for Countering Extremism. The government has refused that. So what it is doing is putting PREVENT firmly within the control of the government and saying that government is going to be the sole arbiter of what counts as being extremist. And that enables that government to declare any particular position extremist as it chooses. Dial down the far right, dial up on other things. So I think, yes, Muslim communities are particularly in the focus, and particularly the expression of the religious expression of Muslim communities in the public sphere. And I think that is a completely illiberal position, to deny Muslims the right to express political positions based upon their religious commitments and values. There's nothing undemocratic about doing that. Indeed, that's at the heart of what democracy should be about. And it's what I think a healthy civil society should be about, listening to the different opinions of different members of society. So instead, what we've got is, and it's the formal definition of extremism, that is a group that has a them and an us, an in-group and an out-group, and defines itself by enmity to the out-group. That definition of extremism, which is core to a lot of what is presented in the area, is now a definition of the government. So we have an extremist government, and a government that has taken to itself all the levers of managing public policy, removing them from the scrutiny of Parliament, but also refusing to allow any process of independent scrutiny through, an independent barrister, which is the case for for terrorism legislation. So I think this is a really dangerous moment for British democracy. It's a dangerous and authoritarian moment within the exercise of executive power. It's particularly directed at Muslims, but it's directed at Muslims to scapegoat Muslims in order to bring in powers and capacities for the government that are going to be directed at other communities, other political groups as well. And finally, what I'd say about that is that we're very close to having a definition of terrorism that includes non-violent terrorist offences, which includes direct action by political organisations like, say, Greenpeace or Extinction Rebellion. So they are now being framed as extra-parliamentary political action, and implicitly problematic from the point of view of understandings of extremism and terrorism. So I think it's very, very dangerous indeed.
Thank you, John. So Richard John spoke quite a bit, very eloquently, about the kind of political and sort of democracy related implications of the review. Do you think that the review will go any way towards enhancing our security within the UK when it comes to counter-extremism and counter-terrorism?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is, of course, no. I don't think it will go any way to enhancing our security, but I think maybe we have to sort of just be a bit sort of careful about using this term security as well. I mean, the way in which the government defines security is, of course, very different to the way in which minority communities, all of us, in fact, define security as something that's lived on a day-to-day basis. And the sort of the excuse of national security as something that affects us all, and therefore requires these sort of strong, pseudo-authoritarian measures, is something that we've been hearing ever since the start of the war on terror. It's just sort of become a lot more kind of embedded within society through these sort of securitization processes of prevent and counter-extremism approaches. And I think it's also just really important just to want to further emphasize what John said about sort of this definitional approach that the government is driving towards, which really sort of problematizes and securitizes anything that takes place outside of a kind of strict definition of what is democracy and parliamentary democracy, or sort of CSOs are engaging with democracy in different ways. These are all legitimate democratic organizations. This is the way that rights are formed and maintained and ensured for future generations. And these are all under attack. And we've seen this through obviously not just through this review, but through legislation over the last sort of 5, 10, 20 years, where there's been this increasing focus on clamping down on activism. We see it as well in this review that there is this sort of this tightening of focus on Muslim civil society organizations. We've seen this through the media in the last sort of year and a half or so, as they've tried to sort of ready some of the ground for this review, focusing particularly on Muslim organizations. And we've seen sort of how Muslim organizations can be sort of squeezed out by governments and shut down in other countries. In France, for instance, has taken a very strong approach towards Muslim activism, helped to sort of shut down and enforce the shutting down of Muslim activist groups. And I wonder whether the government is trying to sort of attempt something else here and to borrow some of these ideas and trying to sort of squeeze the space for anti-Islamophobia organizations, for Muslim activist groups, and also for far left groups. It takes so-called far left groups. It takes aim at groups that it calls sort of far left extremists. It takes aim at education and student unions. And just the other thing as well, I wonder. I don't know, but I do wonder kind of what this will, how this will, whether this sort of takes away a supporting leg for some of the PREVENT, sort of those who have supported PREVENT for the last sort of 5 or 10 years or so, that have justified it on this sort of safeguarding strategy, have hinged it on the idea that it's all extremisms being treated equally. It's not just about so-called Islamism, it's about the far right, it's about all other forms of extremism that they can find. And that actually maybe this sort of this turning back of the clock onto Islamism, so-called Islamism, and these ideas really sort of kicks away one of the supporting legs for PREVENT. And we've seen some of the usual supporters for PREVENT have gone very quiet in recent days since the review has been released. And I just wonder what impact that will have. I don't know if any of you have any views on this, but what impact that will have on those who have sought to publicly justify the PREVENT strategy by saying that this is safeguarding, which is now being undermined and removed by this review, and by saying that it treats all kinds of extremism equally.
Thank you, Richard. John, maybe just to wrap up, do you have anything to kind of add to what Richard mentioned there at the end?
I'd just reinforce what he said about the attack upon safeguarding, because if you take away safeguarding, you do have, and say you're going to refocus. Well, that refocus is potentially straightforwardly vulnerable to accusations of discrimination. But the second thing is, it's called safeguarding, and this is what we have to keep emphasizing, because nobody drawn into PREVENT has committed any offense. They've not done anything wrong. Everything they've done is perfectly lawful. Even if you get to the 8% who are identified as worthy of adoption onto a channel program, they've not done anything wrong either. So how do you justify such heavy intervention in the lives of individuals and their families without saying it's to protect them from some kind of exploitation? So if you're saying, no, they represent, we're protecting the public from them, you're protecting the public from people who have done nothing wrong, have committed no harmful activities. It's not even, they did in 2013, I think it was, suggest that there should be some kind of equivalent of an ASBO. If you had an ASBO for extremism, say, which was you'd have to take it to a magistrate's court. You'd have to have a proper process for it. It's a fact that they can't find a process that is really worrying. And safeguarding was a fig leaf, and they've stripped the fig leaf off, as Richard so powerfully said. So, I mean, I think that's, I think there'll be difficulty in persuading people in the sectors who are supposed to apply PREVENT that that this is really a duty directed to safeguard individuals. They won't accept it to safeguard the Conservative government.
Thank you very much, John and Richard. Fascinating discussion, some very, very interesting insights, although at times somewhat depressing, let's be honest. But, you know, something that very much needed to be discussed, you know, given kind of the developments this week. And here at Community Policy Forum, please do kind of keep abreast of our work. We've already put out an explainer on the origins of the Shawcross Review. And of course, we've been able to hold this wonderful discussion today with two amazing guests, John Holmwood and Richard McNeil-Willson, both of whom have very, very kindly given up their time from their busy schedules in order to discuss this very pertinent issue. So thank you once again, both of you. Thank you to all of you that have been watching and listening, and take care of yourselves.